I prefer silver splitters. 70 is the new 52.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life. This week, we had Kimberly Nelson on the show, and we had a great conversation about gray divorce, what that means, and how divorcing later in life affects your financial well-being. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Kimberly Nelson is joining us. Kimberly is a financial advisor at Coastal Bridge Advisors in Santa Monica, California. Kimberly is also a certified divorce financial analyst and is passionate about uncomplicating it for her clients. Today, Kimberly and I will be discussing navigating the unique challenges of gray divorce, protecting your retirement and assets with practical tips, and how to manage the emotional and legal complexities of late life divorce. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to discuss this topic. I think that it is especially interesting in the state of Florida because Florida is where a lot of people go to retire. And so this could not be a better topic for your listeners.
Yes, it really is. And you know, what I've seen throughout my many years of practice is that there's a lot of divorce over 55, over 60. I think that's where we see quite the majority of divorces happening. So it's going to be great to dive into that here because financial situation, is different at that time than when you're younger in your marriage divorcing. Kimberly, we're so glad to have you back on our show. You are a repeat visitor, which we love. For our listeners who didn't hear our other episode on alimony, we'd love it if you could share a little bit of your background and how you got to become a certified divorce financial analyst.
Absolutely. I've been at it for about 20 years now. I started my career as a financial advisor at the big banks, and I've been with the same team for 19 of my 20 years in the business. My team and I rose up through the big banks, and about 8 years ago, we followed the trend and became independent, which is better for the clients, in my opinion, and better for us in terms of independence and objectivity. So we joined an independent firm called Coastal Bridge Advisors that was headquartered in Connecticut, and my partner and I anchor Los Angeles for the firm. I became a chartered divorce financial analyst many years ago when I realized what a need there was in this space, especially for the representation of the women out there in divorce. Very few women in my industry, and I'm really proud to be one of them and further the education and empowerment of women in this space.
Well, let's start simple today. And for our listeners, what exactly is gray divorce?
Gray divorce is a topic that really is picking up some steam, and it's kind of a buzzword now. Gray divorce sounds kind of bland and boring. I prefer silver splitters. I don't, 70 is the new 52. And when we divorce, when we're older, lifespans are longer than they've ever been. Silver splitters sound more distinguished. There's so much life left in our 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think that, a key to gray divorce, two big things. We're not as young, like you said, Heather. So, we've got a lot of life experience at that point. There's not a whole lot of time left to be earning an income. We're going to be relying more on the assets we've set aside. And our divorce negotiation becomes even more important because the ability to go out and make that money again isn't there. That's the big difference I see.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And it is. It's so important to evaluate the assets, obviously when you're older. Now, why do you think gray divorces have become more common? If you think of it as social or economics?
I say both, Heather. I say both because I think that women are kind of in a place now where we realize that we can do it on our own. And if we're in a relationship that's not serving us, we do feel more empowered to go out and either find a new relationship or do it on our own, one of those two things. And if you think about it, in the context of humanity, women have been in the workforce for just one hot minute. I mean, since Rosie the Riveter showed us her biceps, it hasn't been that many years in the context of humanity. So we're still finding our place and starting our empowerment journey there. Since 1990, about 30, 35 years ago, the divorce rate for those over 50 has doubled. and the divorce rate for those over 65 has tripled. I think a lot of that has to do with longer lifespans. People are realizing at 67, I have a lot of life left, and I'm not sure I want to spend it like this. I'm a huge fan of marriage because I'm a huge fan of commitment that arises from true love. So I'm a big marriage fan. I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. But I do understand, too, that with longer lifespans, relationships can evolve. And if the relationship is no longer a healthy place to be, our silver splitters are recognizing that they're better off doing something different and changing that relationship. A lot of them can turn it into a friendship. I think that if you've had a 30-year marriage, the chances of you maintaining some sort of friendship after that are probably higher. You know, you've spent a lot of life together. You've raised your kids together. You might even have grandchildren together at this point. I think most of the couples that I know that have divorced that are over 65, they've divorced very amicably and it's worked out.
I think that's a great perspective, and it's true. So if those are the baby boomers that we're talking about that are divorcing now, the majority of them got married very young, and a lot of those women didn't have as many options for careers or their roles. And I think that they get to this point, and especially, you know, healthy 60s, 70s, and they're thinking, and I've had this conversation more than once, that I'm not going to spend any more time with this person. We are not compatible. He doesn't want to spend time with me. He's gotten grumpy or hateful. I now realize I can do this on my own and I want to. And I think they feel like they know now that they can. That has played a big role. Many of the women may have, you know, at least understand what the finances are, but they don't know really how it's going to affect them, right? Like, what am I going to get? How is that going to work? And that can be a big part of that process that helps them realize you're going to be okay. They've been saving and they've got the retirement, because it is a unique situation if we are looking at a divorce and the husband's retired or they're both retired. So now we've got what we've got, and we've really got to look at how are we going to divide it if they've been married the entire time.
Exactly. And it's both an easier discussion and a more daunting one at the same time, right? Because there's less uncertainty in terms of what are we going to have. It's what we have is what we have, but it can be a little more daunting because it's kind of like, oh boy, if he's a year or two away from retirement or already retired, then alimony becomes a whole different discussion. There may not be much there. I mean, if he's just collecting Social Security and she's doing the same, well, then it's going to be hard to count on some kind of an alimony arrangement. The assets that we have are going to have to provide for two households. Running two separate households is a lot more expensive than just running one combined household, you know, right? There's a lot of synergies in one combined household. That's why 20-somethings often live with roommates, because you're splitting expenses. After we're married, we're essentially roommating for a very long time, splitting expenses. So the marital standard of living is likely going to drop for both parties. Right now, for some strange reason, the marital standard of living when people divorce drops a lot more for the women than it does for the men. And so trying to close that income gap and figure that out is a big part of this. For the record, Heather, the divorce rate in this country right now overall is actually down from where it was a few years ago. We had a good surge during COVID. Through the last couple of decades, it's actually down. But the silver splitters are growing big time in numbers. I don't know what's really driving that. I think that people are getting married a little bit later. We're not doing it when we're 20 anymore, like a lot of our silver splitters did. That might be a combination of people knowing themselves better before they get into a marriage, but also maybe people aren't getting married, but they're just cohabitating. That's kind of another trend that we have seen. And cohab arrangements and cohabitating is rapidly catching up to be recognized essentially as a marriage. So you have to be careful there with cohabitating also. But with these silver splitters, there's less time to make up for any financial detriments that may arise from the divorce. That is the biggest difference and the thing we have to be most mindful of.
Absolutely. Now, in your experience working with individuals who are divorcing, who've been married for decades, what have you seen as far as that emotional aspect that is different than in a shorter term divorce?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the big one is that most of these people do not remember adulting without this person in their life, right? If someone is 70 and they're getting divorced, they may have gotten married at 20 or 25, because we did things earlier back then, 50 years ago. So they went straight from their father's house into their husband's house, as people like to say. If someone's divorcing after a shorter term marriage, they might have gotten married at 32. And so they had 10 years outside of college, or even had the ability to go to college, because a lot of women, especially that are in their 70s, maybe college was not something that they placed a lot of priority on for women back in the day. And so I think there's just a lot more fear from the idea of doing it all alone when I've been doing it with somebody for this long. Maybe even allowing that other person to drive certain parts of the relationship dynamic, like the money part. It's possible that he handled the finances completely and she just trusted him to do that, and now she has to do it herself. And that is really, really scary. I think the scariest part for some of the dads out there, some of the men, maybe it's having the kids by themselves versus doing that with a partner. But that's off the table when we're splitting in our later years. The kids are grown. So a lot of the parts that they may have been taking the lead on, they're very comfortable with that, and that's fine. But the parts that maybe she wasn't taking the lead on, now she has to do that. And so there's a lot of fear and trepidation that comes with that. And again, we solve that problem by leaning on professionals. If he was your partner on the finances, now you've got a new partner. You've got a financial advisor that's going to help you with that. With your taxes, there's going to be a CPA that you trust that's going to help you with that. Estate planning attorneys are a big part of this. The divorce attorney, of course, is the person that coordinates all of this on your behalf and has been through this many times and is going to help you figure out the best thing to do. But yeah, it is a really emotional thing. There's a lot more about it that's scary than if you've been married for 8 years and you're divorcing at age 38. Very different.
And now with retirement, savings are often a concern in gray divorces. How have you seen older couples in your experience and manage the division of pensions, 401ks, and IRAs? Because I think for some, of our listeners who might be older, they're like, how does that even happen? That may seem overwhelming.
That's a lot. And the retirement accounts tend to be a lot bigger for couples that are divorcing when they're in their 60s or 70s versus in their 30s. So for a long-term marriage, there may be more equity in the home. The buyout really becomes daunting because there's a lot of equity in this home that we've been paying a mortgage on for 20, 25 years on a 30-year mortgage. So if one party wants to buy the other out, it's a huge equalization payment. Dividing retirement accounts, thankfully, is pretty simple. IRA accounts can be divided really easily and quickly by the custodian or the brokerage firm holding it. We just open up a new account for the spouse that's receiving part of the others. And then the custodian or the brokerage firm will send over the assets as per the divorce decree. If we have a 401k that's not rolled into an IRA, then we divide that up with a quadro. It stands for Qualified Retirement Distribution Order.
But either way,
it's what you got to have.
It's what you got to have.
And so, with the quadro, Qualified Domestic Relations Order is what I think it stands for. But we have one of those. We use a quadro expert, and we will get the 401k divided pretty quickly and easily as well. So, with all of that, it's something that you don't have to worry about too terribly much. Your financial advisor will help you get all of this done when it's all said and done. And that's kind of a big overlooked part as well, Heather. It's like once we have the signed divorce decree, who is running the show and making sure that what that decree says is actually being implemented? Who does that? I think that the divorcee is not in a great position. My team runs point on that real well, and we make sure that what that decree says is what happens, because it's really important that you actually take possession of your assets. In gray divorce, the retirement accounts are larger. The income coming in outside of assets is smaller, and home equity can be a challenging problem.
What have you seen that are some financial mistakes people make most often during a gray divorce, and how can they avoid them?
Some financial mistakes that people make, I think it's not understanding the assets and negotiating from a place of not understanding what the tax nature is of the assets. Retirement accounts are not all created equal. Roth IRAs and traditional IRAs are very different. They sound and look the same on a statement, but a Roth IRA is a retirement account where you're taxed on the money before it goes in. So you pull it out tax-free. You don't pay taxes on the growth, and you don't pay any further income tax when you pull it out. A traditional IRA is the reverse. You have a tax benefit on the way in, And you're taxed on what you pull out at income tax rates when you pull it out. So if you have a Roth IRA and a traditional, and he's saying to you, tell you what, you take the traditional, I'll take the Roth, and that's fair. No, it absolutely is not. What I would say is, well, if that's fair, then give us the Roth, you take the traditional, because they're not the same. And so I think that the biggest mistake people make is negotiating from a place of not understanding exactly what these assets are and how they can work for you in the future. Same thing with home equity. If you have a large brokerage account somewhere and you also have a nice home, and you really want to stay in the home, and you say, I'll give you more of that brokerage account because I want to stay in the home. It may look even on the marital balance sheet, but we have to consider the cost basis of the home, because if you want to downsize in 5 years, you're going to be on the hook solely for any taxes due on the sale of the home. We have to look at that and make sure that you're not going to be hit with a huge tax bill. If you traded assets that are at a high cost basis to him, then he can sell those assets and do whatever he wants with them, and he won't owe anything in tax. The person that took the brokerage account is actually better off than the person that took the house. We try to think about what your priorities are. If your priority is to stay in the house, that's absolutely fine. We're going to consider that and see how we can make that work. But when we're negotiating, it's going to be more apples to apples. And we're going to say, well, if we're going to trade high basis assets for a low basis asset, then we're going to negotiate with him to actually give him less, because the net value of what he's receiving is more, right? So thinking about it from that place is really important, and especially in a divorce where people are older, because again, there's less time to make it back.
Do older divorcing couples need to consider long-term care or health insurance costs differently in your experience than younger couples?
Yeah, I would say yes to that, Heather. Definitely. I think that older divorcing couples do need to consider long-term care and health insurance costs more carefully than younger couples, because by the time a younger couple gets there, a lot of changes could have taken place, right? So we don't really know what we're dealing with till we get there, but the older couple is there. And as they're aging now, medical expenses, potential long-term care needs, the need for comprehensive health insurance increases significantly. They're more likely to require specialized care. Medicare may not cover all the necessary services. Long-term care insurance, Medicaid planning, careful division of health-related assets like HSAs, health savings accounts, or pension plans become critical considerations. So failing to plan for these costs can severely impact post-divorce financial stability. Understanding Medicare and what you could be provided for under the state is important and critical. But again, if one spouse is still working and will be for the next handful of years, once the divorce is final, you will fall off of their insurance if that's where you've been getting your insurance from. Understanding what a private policy for yourself is going to cost, and that's more costly as we age, right? So that has to be worked in, and we have to figure that out in the settlement. So there's something called COBRA. It's an acronym, and I know a lot of you heard of it, but you're allowed to COBRA your health insurance for a period of time post-divorce or after leaving a place of employment. So looking at COBRA and figuring out what the time frames are there, and then coming up with a new solution is critical. We work with a great insurance partner on all of that. There are resources out there, and your team will be able to guide you toward the right resources.
Absolutely. Those are great points that you make, because for our listeners, these are the things that you don't learn just in a mediation or a settlement conference. This is what you want your attorney and your, financial advisors to be working on in a divorce, so that when it's time to come to a settlement, you have a complete picture. With health insurance, that's a huge cost, especially if you're no longer going to be covered, that you really need to understand and contemplate in your plan. In particular, let's say in California, in your experience, how have you seen spousal support come into play when one spouse has significantly more retirement savings or actually income potential than their other spouse, even though they're both, in whether 60s or 70s? How do you guys look at that? What's your experience been in California?
Absolutely. In California, we're a community property state, of course. And so anything that was earned during the marriage is looked at as community property. So the marriage was 20 or 30 years, then each spouse is entitled to whatever was placed into those retirement accounts plus their growth during that time. So if we have someone that's claiming separate property, then we're going to want to see a statement for that IRA the month before the marriage, see what that IRA was worth, and then see what was added to it during that time. And we try to come up with something reasonable. We back out the contributions plus growth, and that becomes community, right? So same thing with the 401k. So, it's actually a relatively similar process in a gray divorce versus a divorce at any age. We try to figure out what portion of it's community, what portion of that growth is attributed to those community assets also. And then we try to split that fairly. The income potential of one spouse versus the other is always taken into account. Income potential is less important during a gray divorce because the earning years just aren't there anymore. We can take into account his earning potential, but if he's 63, then we know that he's going to be entitled to his retirement in just a couple of years. And if he chooses to retire, then that's his prerogative. He's no longer under any obligation to support. Of course, it's a case-by-case basis, and we'll see what happens with ultra-high net worth situations. Sometimes he is required to support beyond that with the assets he has. The court retains jurisdiction, and anything could happen. A big part of this is looking at the assets that are going to wind up coming your way and working to fit life inside of that, because the alimony and ongoing support is a much bigger wild card and probably can't be counted on to the same extent as if we were all much younger. And there generally aren't young children to be supported at the home either. And that's a big consideration when we're talking about support from one spouse to the other. How do they look at that in Florida, Heather? Is it a lot different or is it pretty similar?
Well, it recently changed. The laws changed as far as retirement when permanent alimony was abolished. And so now the question will be, because personally, I think we'll probably see this change over the next 15 to 20 years, but you just don't see people retiring at 63, even 65 anymore, because they're still quite able, particularly here where I am in this part of Florida, but in general in Florida, where there's all these big corporations where you're retiring with this large pension. That doesn't necessarily exist anymore. Usually you will see that the state employees age out. They have a certain number of years, but they do have quite a lucrative pension plan, which is interesting. And I think we should bring this up because it made me think about it. For individuals in a gray divorce, particularly if they've already retired or no retirement is coming, and you can, I'm sure, Kimberly, speak more extensively on this, but let's say, because I was just thinking of the judges, they've got to retire after a certain age. But so they would be within the state of Florida. So they're going to get a state pension. And before they elect to take it, they have an opportunity to choose the benefit for their spouse, right? If they're married. Once you're receiving it, you can't go back and change that here in Florida. That's a pretty significant benefit that we always look to see if that exists. Similarly, it's something in the military we negotiate, because if you've elected the survivor benefit in your retirement, that's huge, because that's the only way to protect the spouses in a lot of these situations. They're part of that pension or retirement. Have you dealt a lot with that at all?
With regard to pensions that people have coming, it is certainly a part of the negotiation. And when people do retire, that's an important component. I see more like RSUs, shares of closely held businesses and deferred comp being split for people. Pensions, like defined benefit plans and whatnot, are kind of vanishing from the world. Companies aren't offering them as much anymore. So that does come up less, but if it exists, it's definitely on the table for splitting. It's definitely something that we take into account. It could be bought out with other assets, pension assets. If it's defined contributions and defined benefit pension assets are totally different animals. If he has a defined benefit coming his way, then we're going to want to try to calculate that and see what portion she would be entitled to and what she would have coming. Defined contributions, those are set amounts, and those can be split 50-50. So we do see pensions, I would say, are a little less common, but still something to be very mindful of, and it's an asset and it matters in the context of the divorce.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. In your experience with your clients, have you come across any unique financial challenges for individuals in dating or remarrying after a gray divorce?
The biggest one, of course, is if there is any kind of an alimony arrangement, that would go away. With gray divorce, if there is no alimony arrangement, I've found that the further along in life people are, the more content they are to not remarry. Things are a bit more complicated because they've got adult children from the previous marriage that they want to protect the inheritance of. If they're not going to be having children again, I think they find companionship to be enough and don't require marriage. Anybody who does embark on a marriage again, I love the commitment behind marriage. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think that you absolutely should not get married because of any other reason other than you don't want to. It shouldn't be financial. It shouldn't be any other reason. Prenups are a big thing. Prenups are much bigger when people are older. I think they've learned their lesson. When you have more assets to potentially lose through a second marriage, people are a lot more mindful of that. So a good solid prenup protects both the spouse with the money and the spouse that maybe has less money. The prenup dictates up front what's going to happen with all the assets and what will be split and what won't be. When you have the conversation around money before you go into the marriage will tend to be more successful. And the numbers show this. Couples that have prenups tend to stay married more often than couples that do not. I don't think it's anything related to the prenup itself, where people are thinking, well, definitely won't get divorced. There's this prenup. I think it's more or less that they've been able to communicate. When you're able to do that, you can have conversations about other things too. When something's going on in the marriage that maybe isn't serving you or working for you, you're going to be able to talk about it and maybe fix it before it gets to a place where it's not fixable. I am a huge advocate for prenups, and I think it's good for everyone, especially good for the children of each party, because then we all know what is going to be happening. If there is a death, for example, or a divorce, there's no question about what was supposed to happen. Everyone's in the know. And then what was meant to happen happens. But when we don't do this planning and then something happens, either a divorce or a death of one of the spouses, well, then everybody is questioning what the intention was. Everyone's questioning what this person really meant when they said this in passing a few years ago. Do we kick out our stepdad, mom's husband, out of the house that she owned? Would she have wanted that? I don't know. You can grant your spouse lifetime use of the house while still leaving the asset to your kids. There's ways to do all of these things. So estate planning has really come a long way and has provided for a lot of things that marriage itself used to provide for, but all sorts of different living arrangements these days can be accommodated with the right estate planning. So that's the trend that I've seen.
Absolutely. There's a lot that can be done. What advice would you give to women contemplating a divorce later in life, especially when it comes to securing their financial future?
Mm-hmm. And the advice there is relatively similar at any age. I think step number one is knowing what it costs to run your household. Know what your debts are, know what your assets are, know what you're spending. If you really don't know, you can start in a couple different places. You can start by downloading your checking account statements wherever you're spending your money. Figure out where it's all going. Create a conscious spending plan. Understand what you're spending, where it's going. The tax return is another great place to look. You can see what money's coming in, what you're earning, making sure that you have your own separate logins to all of your accounts is. So that becomes very important, because what we're going to have to do is have a reconciliation between the assets that you have and the income they can provide and the income that you need to live your best life during your platinum years, post-divorce, when you're living the life you really want to live. So education is key, and knowledge is power. So just make sure you know what you have and where it's all going. That way you'll be able to start planning for your future, assuming that you want to divorce simply because you don't want to be in this marriage. I wouldn't want anyone staying in the marriage because they were too afraid to leave it. That's the thing we want to inoculate against through this planning.
Education, figure out what's there, and seek out professionals to help you understand. That's the first step, because that will influence your decisions. The questions you're going to have for either a financial advisor or your attorney are going to be better answered if you have done the best you can to understand your financial picture.
Right.
Well, I can't believe it. We are almost done with the show. And Kimberly, I always ask all our guests before they leave if they can impart on our listeners what they've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience.
Absolutely. I've found that women at any age are extremely capable of managing their lives, their finances, and their decisions. We are more driven by our emotions as well, which makes us incredibly empathetic and nurturing. It can work against us during times of extreme stress, like a divorce. We have to recognize, give ourselves some grace for what we're feeling. But women can be very powerful in taking their lives back once educated about their spending, budgeting, saving, income, etc. What has surprised me the most is women's ability to stick to their financial plans once they have a clear path ahead of them. Even if there are some difficulties, knowing what those boundaries are, understanding why you're doing what you're doing, they're able to stick with it and take control. No matter what stage you're in of your separation, your divorce, wherever you are, just start from where you're at. It's never too late to start taking control today. You're not behind anybody because the only person that matters in this situation is you. Wherever you are, it's okay. You're going to start from today and move forward. And a year from now, you're going to be in a much, much better place. And you know, you've got a whole team around you and a lot of resources. Be intentional, be powerful.
Thank you so much. Lastly, Kimberly, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
My firm is Coastal Bridge Advisors. www.coastalbridgeadvisors is the website. I'm Kimberly Nelson on there. My email address, my phone number are there. So I'll share my email address with everybody here. First initial, last name, K Nelson at Coastal Bridge Advisors. Advisors is spelled with an ORS at the end, .com. And would love to hear from anybody that has questions or wants to talk about it. Heather, I just have to thank you again for your advocacy and what you do for women every single day in helping them to move on strong from whatever it is moving on from. There's a huge need. Gray divorce is such a big thing in Florida, and I'm just glad that you are there for them as a resource, and I hope that they all reach out to you as well.
Well, thank you so much. And we've reached the end of our show today. Again, thank you to Kimberly Nelson for joining us to discuss gray divorce, what it means for you and your financial well-being. We really appreciate your time. Listeners, if you or someone you know is going through divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at floridawomensLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our website in the show notes, as well as all the information about Kimberly Nelson and her firm. Thank you all for listening.